I was only supposed to be her fake boyfriend for one Sunday dinner. She was a single mother with a little girl, and her relatives kept looking at her like she'd failed at something. I agreed because I fix things for a living, and I figured this was just another broken thing I could patch up and walk away from. I didn't know, that first time across from her, that her daughter would ask me the one question I wasn't ready for. And I didn't know a single evening would turn into the thing I'd been quietly waiting my whole life to find. My name is Daniel, and I fix old houses for a living. I sand the floors other people have given up on. I straighten the doors that stopped closing years ago. I make the broken parts of a home work again, and then I pack my tools and leave, and I almost never see the place after that. It's honest work, and it keeps my hands busy enough that my mind doesn't have to ask the questions I don't want to answer. I live alone in a small rented house at the edge of town. The porch faces a quiet road, and the kitchen window looks out over a yard I never quite finished tending. Most nights, I eat dinner standing at that window, watching the porch lights come on in the houses down the street. I always thought those lights were a small thing. Then I noticed how every one of them turned on because someone was coming home to someone, and I realized I had been watching them like a hungry man watches a lit kitchen. I'm 32, and I've been on my own long enough that the quiet stopped feeling lonely and started feeling normal. That's the part I should be honest about. I wasn't sitting around feeling sorry for myself. I had my work, my routines, a couple of friends I saw on weekends. It just didn't have anyone in it who would notice if I stopped showing up. There was a house I worked on last winter, an old place on a hill where a woman had lived alone for 30 years after her husband passed. I refinished her kitchen floor over 4 cold days, and on the last afternoon she made me sit down and eat soup with her before I left. She talked about her husband like he'd just stepped into the next room, and I remember thinking that a house could hold a person that long and still feel warm. I drove home that night and stood at my window and wondered what my house would hold if I disappeared tomorrow. The answer was quiet, and it stayed with me. My father taught me to fix things. He had a workshop behind our old house, and I spent most of my childhood at his side, handing him the wrong tool and learning the right one by the look on his face. He died when I was 19, and I kept one photograph of that workshop, the one where the afternoon light came through the dusty window and made the whole bench glow. I kept it because it was the only place I ever felt like I belonged to something. I didn't know it then, but belonging was the thing I'd spend the next 13 years quietly looking for, in every house I fixed, without ever once knocking on the door after I left. So that's the man who said yes when she asked. A man good with his hands and slow with his words, who spent his life repairing homes he'd never live in. I thought I was the safe kind of lonely, the kind that doesn't cost anyone anything. I was about to find out that the safest way to live alone is also the slowest way to forget you were ever hoping for more. And maybe that's why I didn't see her coming. When you spend years teaching yourself not to want, you stop watching the road for the thing you're waiting for. You keep your head down and your hands busy, and you tell yourself the quiet is enough. Then someone asks you to sit at their table, and you find out it never was. Her name is Charlotte, and I'd met her 3 times before the day she changed everything. She runs a small flower shop on the main road, the kind with a painted sign and buckets of cut flowers spilling onto the sidewalk in warm weather. I'd replaced a warped shelf behind her counter one winter, fixed a sticking door the next spring, and mended the old greenhouse frame out back when a storm bent it. She always paid in cash and sent me home with a wrapped bunch of whatever was blooming. I always took it home and put it in a jar and watched it die, because I didn't know the first thing about keeping something alive. She's a brunette with calm hands and a stillness that comes from handling sharp things all day. I noticed her like you notice a room with good light, without thinking too much about why. She had a way of asking questions that made you answer more than you meant to, and she listened like what you said actually landed somewhere. Then, one Thursday, she called and asked if I'd meet her for coffee, and I said yes before I thought about how strange that was. She was already at a back table when I got there, 2 cups waiting, and she didn't waste time on small talk. She told me she needed a favor, a big one, and that I was the only person she trusted not to make it worse. She needed a boyfriend for one Sunday dinner at her mother's house. Not a real one. A man who'd sit beside her, hold her hand, smile at the right moments, and tell a story about how they met that was close enough to true to hold up under questions. One evening, a few hours, and then we'd go back to being exactly what we were. I asked her why, because the request didn't make sense coming from a woman who seemed to have her life in order. She told me about her husband, who'd left 3 years ago. Not in some dramatic way, but in the quiet way that hurts worse, by simply stopping. He stopped coming home, then he stopped calling, and one day she realized she was the only adult in the house, and her daughter was the only one who still asked where he was. Since then, her family had treated her like a project that needed finishing. Her mother paraded eligible men through her life like she was interviewing replacements. Her older sister told everyone how brave she was, which made Charlotte want to scream. She didn't want brave. She wanted one evening where they looked at her like she was fine. She slid a folded napkin across the table, and on it she'd written the bones of our story, how we met, how long we'd been together, what I did for work, the small details that make a lie feel lived in. She'd thought about this like she arranges flowers, with every stem placed on purpose. I looked at that napkin for a long time. I should have said no, because I'm a man who can't lie smoothly, and I didn't want to be the next person to let her down. But she wasn't asking me to fix her life. She was asking me to fix one dinner. And somewhere under all my reasons to refuse, there was a smaller, hungrier reason pushing the other way. I wanted a reason to sit at someone's table that didn't end with me picking up my tools. So I told her I'd do it, and the relief on her face told me this mattered more than she was letting on. I asked her what scared her most about the whole plan. She thought about it for a second before she answered. She said it wasn't her family finding out. It was her daughter, who watched every new person like a small animal watches a new sound, deciding on her own time whether it's safe to come closer. Charlotte said she'd kept Lily away from everyone for 3 years, and now she was about to hand her a stranger and call him family for a night. That was the part that scared her, and hearing her say it scared me too, because I understood then that I wasn't just guarding her pride. I was walking into a child's hope, and those break in ways that don't heal clean. Before the dinner, she said, there was someone I had to meet. I drove to her house the next afternoon, a small blue place with a crooked mailbox and a porch step that bounced when you stepped on it. Charlotte opened the door with a look that said she was more nervous about this part than about the dinner itself. She led me through to the kitchen, where her daughter was drawing at the table. Her name is Lily, and she was 4 years old. She didn't look up when I came in. She was coloring with the serious concentration of someone much older, her small hand moving in careful strokes, and she let me stand there long enough to understand that she was deciding what to make of me. Children who've been left do this. They watch first, and they decide on their own time whether it's safe to come closer. Charlotte poured me coffee and laid out the rules while Lily listened without seeming to. No fighting in front of her, no promises that weren't real. And when the dinner was over, it was over. We wouldn't let it bleed into something Lily could mistake for a permanent change. Charlotte said it quietly and firmly, and I could see how carefully she'd built this boundary, because she knew exactly how easily a child starts to hope and how long it takes them to stop. We went over the story on the napkin until I could tell it without looking, and Charlotte corrected the parts that wouldn't survive her family. She was thorough in a way that surprised me, trimming the lie down to its smallest possible shape so that almost everything I'd say would be true. I admired that, even as it made me sadder. She'd learned to keep her lies small, because the big ones were what had broken her house in the first place. Then Lily slid a piece of paper across the table toward me without a word. It was a crayon drawing of 3 people holding hands in front of a house, 2 tall ones and 1 small one, with a yellow sun and a crooked chimney. She didn't explain it. She just watched my face while I looked at it, and I felt something shift in my chest that I had no name for. I folded that drawing and put it in my jacket pocket, and I told Lily it was the best picture of a house I'd ever seen. She went back to coloring, satisfied, and Charlotte watched the 2 of us with an expression I couldn't read all the way to the bottom. Lily took my hand after that and pulled me through the house to show me her room, a small space covered in drawings and a shelf of books her mother read to her at night. She pointed to a bed that was too big for her and told me her stuffed rabbit slept at the other end so she wouldn't be alone. I stood in that doorway and felt the weight of what I'd agreed to land on me all at once. This wasn't a woman's pride I was guarding. It was a child who'd already learned to arrange her loneliness so it didn't touch her. It was only later that I understood what that drawing was. It wasn't a picture of the family she already had. It was a picture of the family she was waiting to show up. I drove home that night with the drawing still in my pocket and a new weight sitting where the old quiet used to be. I'd agreed to fix 1 dinner, and I hadn't planned on the part where a 4-year-old hands you her hopes, folded in half. That was the moment I should have called Charlotte and told her I couldn't do it. I didn't call. I told myself it was because I'd given my word, but the truth was simpler and harder to look at. I wanted to be the tall person in that drawing, and I wasn't ready to admit how much. Sunday came the way Sundays do when you're dreading them, too slow and then all at once. I stood in my small bedroom and buttoned a clean shirt I almost never wore, and I looked at myself in the mirror and thought I looked like a man pretending to be someone, which was exactly what I'd be doing. I'd shaved for the first time in a week, and my face felt too bare, like I'd removed the part of me that knew how to hide. Charlotte picked me up in her old car because she said it'd look more real if we arrived together. Lily was in the back seat in a small blue dress, a box of crayons on her lap, and the moment I got in, she held up a new drawing for me to inspect. It was a picture of a car with 3 people inside, and I told her the car was excellent, which made her smile in a way that made the shirt and the shaving and all of it feel worth the trouble. On the drive, Charlotte ran through the family I was about to face, and she didn't sugarcoat any of it. Her mother measured every person who walked through the door, and she could be gracious and watchful at once in a way that made you feel found out. Her older sister was warm on the surface and sharp underneath, the kind of woman who complimented you and filed away the detail to use later. And her uncle asked questions like a lawyer, calm and patient, circling until he found the seam. She gave me an out as we turned onto the main road. "If it gets bad," she said, "we leave, and there are no hard feelings." I looked over at her, and I saw that she meant it, that she was more afraid of dragging me into something ugly than of being caught without a boyfriend. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and I meant it, though I didn't yet know how much that sentence was going to cost me. We pulled up to a big old house with too many cars in the drive and the sound of a family already loud inside it. The porch was wide and painted white, and there were candles in the windows, and for a second I just sat there and looked at it. It was the kind of house that looked like it had a permanent place for everyone. I was about to walk in pretending I had one of those places, when the truth was, I'd never even sat at a table like this in my life. Charlotte reached over and took my hand. The feeling of it, her fingers laced through mine, was so startling and so right that I forgot to breathe for a second. She squeezed once, a small thank you, and then the screen door opened, and her mother appeared on the porch, and the performance began. I stepped out, and as I did, I felt a small hand slip into my other one. Lily had come around the car and taken hold of me without asking, and she walked me up the steps like she was bringing me home. Her mother met us at the door with a smile that inspected me from the collar down. She was a handsome woman with Charlotte's same stillness, and she welcomed me like a guest she'd already decided to study. Charlotte introduced me as her boyfriend, and the word landed in the hallway and seemed to hang there. I shook her mother's hand and told her the house was beautiful, which was true and therefore safe to say. The dining room was already full when we walked in. Her older sister, Grace, rose to hug Charlotte and then turned to me with that warm, measuring smile, and her uncle nodded from the head of the table with the patient look of a man who'd been waiting to ask questions all week. There were cousins and an aunt, and the low hum of a family that had been together long enough to finish each other's sentences, and I felt every one of them clock me like a room clocks a stranger. We sat, and the questions began the way I'd been warned, gently at first. Grace asked how we met, and I told the story from the napkin, the shelf I fixed, the door that stuck, the greenhouse frame. It was almost entirely true, and that was the trick of it, because the only lie was the part where any of it had been a courtship instead of a work order. Charlotte picked up the thread whenever I hesitated, and we passed the story back and forth like a dish, and I could feel the table starting to lean toward belief. Then her uncle leaned forward and asked, in the calm voice of a man who already half knew the answer, how long we'd been together. I'm not good at lying, and the smooth number I was supposed to say wouldn't come, so I told him the closest thing to the truth I could. I said I'd known her for a while, but that I'd only recently been brave enough to do something about it. The room went soft at that, and I saw Charlotte's eyes find mine across the table, and the look she gave me had nothing to do with the act we were putting on. The close call came when Grace turned the conversation to Charlotte's life since the divorce, all sweetness on the surface. I watched the old wound surface on Charlotte's face before she could smooth it away. Grace meant well, I think, but well-meaning people can cut the deepest because they don't even know they're holding a knife. Charlotte started to answer in that careful, composed voice of hers, and I could see her sister already assembling the next sympathetic line, the next version of how brave she was. I didn't fix it with a lie. Under the table, where no one could see, I reached for Charlotte's hand and held it, and I felt her grip tighten once and then settle. Up above, I kept my face easy and said nothing, and the moment passed like dangerous moments do when you refuse to let them get bigger. Charlotte finished her answer, Grace moved on, and the table never noticed that something had just been held together in the dark. What I didn't expect was her mother. Through the second course, I caught her watching me, but not the way the others had. She wasn't watching the couple. She was watching how I talked to Lily, how I cut her food without being asked, how I leaned down to hear her small question about the salt shaker. And slowly, the suspicion on her face gave way to something softer and harder to name, something that looked less like judgment and more like recognition. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. She was watching a man behave the way a father behaves, and she couldn't tell whether it was real, and the not knowing was the thing that moved her. The plates were being cleared when Lily slid off her chair. She'd been quiet through most of the meal, coloring on a napkin and listening to the grown-ups talk over her head. I thought she was going to the kitchen, or to find a toy, or to do any of the small things a 4-year-old does when she's tired of sitting still. Instead, she walked all the way around the table, her small hand trailing along the backs of the chairs, and she came to a stop right beside me. I felt a tug on my sleeve, gentle and deliberate, like you pull a curtain open when you want someone to look. I looked down, and she lifted her arms the way a child does when she wants to be picked up, and I bent and lifted her onto my knee without thinking about it. She leaned in close, so close that her hair brushed my collar, and she whispered it. Not loud enough for the table, not loud enough for anyone but me, and yet, somehow, loud enough to change the whole room. She asked me if she could call me Daddy. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. Her mother's hand paused over her water glass, and Grace's smile froze in place, and her uncle's fork came to rest. And Charlotte, across the table, went still in a way I'll never forget, her face turning first to stone, and then to a fear so raw I could feel it from where I sat. Inside me, something cracked open. I couldn't say yes because it wasn't true, and a yes would have been the kind of promise that breaks a child worse than no promise at all. I couldn't say no because no would have told her she'd been wrong to hope, and I wasn't yet sure she'd been wrong. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I held her a little closer, and I got down to where she could see my face, and I told her the truest thing I had. I told her I was really glad I was here tonight. I told her I liked sitting at this table with her and her mom, and I told her I wasn't going anywhere right now. It wasn't a yes, and it wasn't a no. It was the small, honest middle that a man who can't lie finds when both of the easy answers would cost too much. Charlotte reached over and gathered Lily gently back to her, murmuring something soft about dessert, and the table slowly remembered how to talk. Someone passed a plate of something sweet. The uncle asked a question about my work. The machinery of the dinner groaned back to life. But something had broken open that none of us could tuck back inside the evening, and I could feel it sitting in the air between me and Charlotte, like a door we'd both walked through and couldn't walk back. I'd come to fix one dinner. I hadn't come to be asked to stay forever by a voice that barely reached my collar. And now I was holding a crayon drawing in my pocket and a question in my chest, and I didn't know which one was heavier. We left soon after dessert, early enough to be polite and late enough to look normal, and the three of us walked out to the car in the blue evening light. Charlotte buckled Lily in without a word, and the little girl was asleep before we reached the end of the block, her crayons still loose in her lap, her head tipped against the window. The quiet in the car was the loudest quiet I'd ever sat in. Charlotte stared out the passenger window at the houses sliding past, and I drove and didn't trust myself to speak, because every sentence I could think of was the wrong shape. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that her daughter was just a child who said things, that it didn't have to mean anything. But that would have been a lie, and I'd already used up my share of lies for one evening, and I wasn't willing to spend another one on something this important. She spoke first, and her voice was careful, the careful it gets when someone's trying very hard not to break. She told me she was sorry. She said she should never have let Lily get close enough to hope, that she'd been so careful for 3 years to keep her daughter from attaching to anyone, and that she'd ruined it in one dinner because she wanted one night of peace for herself. She said she'd understand if I wanted to forget the whole thing. That was my out. She was handing it to me like an open door, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk through it. Walk away, the instinct said, the way you always do. Fix the dinner and leave. Don't become the next man who lets that little girl down. You don't know how to stay. You've never stayed. Staying is the one thing you've never fixed, because you can't fix it with your hands. I almost took it. I almost said the kind thing, the safe thing, the thing that would have let me drive home and unpack this whole evening into the quiet where I keep everything that scares me. I opened my mouth to say we could just call it a night and a favor and leave it there. Then I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw Lily sleeping with her cheek pressed against the glass. I thought about the drawing in my jacket pocket, the 3 people in front of the house, and the door inside me that I'd kept shut for 13 years, shifted on its hinges. I didn't say the safe thing. I didn't say anything at all, and the silence I chose was different from the silence I'd been handed, because this one had a shape to it, the shape of a man deciding not to run, even when the running was easy. I walked them to the door when we got to her house, and Charlotte stood on the porch with the light above her making a halo of her dark hair, waiting for me to make it simple for both of us and go. I didn't kiss her. I wasn't ready for that, and she wasn't either, and it would have been one more thing pretending to be more than it was. What I did was tell her I'd see her tomorrow. I said it plainly, and I meant it in a way that surprised me, the way a sentence can surprise you when it comes from somewhere deeper than your head. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face loosened just a little, like a fist unclenching. Then she carried Lily inside, and I stood on the porch I hadn't yet fixed and listened to the lock turn. I drove home to my quiet house and lay awake most of the night, holding a crayon drawing and a question I didn't know how to answer. The next morning, I went back to my routine, because routine is the thing that's kept me upright for 13 years. I made coffee, I loaded my tools, I drove to a job refinishing a stranger's dining table, and I sanded it smooth and thought about nothing at all, which is exactly how I get through the days when I don't want to think. Except this time the nothing wouldn't hold. The grain of the wood kept turning into the lines of a crayon drawing, and the quiet of the workshop kept filling with a small voice asking me a question I hadn't answered. I sanded that table until my arms ached. Then I sat in the truck in the driveway and stared at the steering wheel and admitted the thing I'd been refusing to say all morning. The silence in my house didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like something missing. I drove to Charlotte's shop in the late afternoon, not with a fix, not with a plan, not with any of the things I usually bring when I show up somewhere. I just showed up. She was closing out the register, and when she saw me come through the door, she went very still, the way she'd looked at the dinner when Lily asked her question. I understood that she'd spent the whole day waiting for me to do the opposite of what I was doing now. I didn't have a speech. I told her I was there, and that I'd been thinking, and that I didn't want to pretend the dinner hadn't happened. She was careful with me, the careful you're with something that might still turn around and walk out, and she said she didn't know what to do with a man who came back, because the men in her life had a habit of not. I told her I wasn't them, and I knew that was a small thing to say against a big history, so I didn't ask her to believe it. I asked her to watch. She let me walk her home. Lily was on the porch with a sitter, and when she saw me, her face broke into that serious, deciding look. Then she ran down the bouncing step and grabbed my hand and pulled me around to the backyard to show me where the rabbits came at dusk. I crouched there with her in the fading light while she whispered about the rabbits, and Charlotte watched from the door, and the look on her face was the one the whole story had been building toward. Hope, so afraid of its own name it could barely lift its head. That evening, Charlotte made us all dinner, and Lily set the table with an extra fork for me without being asked, and nobody said anything about it, and that small fork did something to me I wasn't ready for. I sat at that table and ate food someone had made for me in a house that wasn't mine, and for the first time in years, the sound of forks on plates didn't feel like something I was overhearing from outside. The next day I came back and fixed the porch step that had been bouncing underfoot for a year. I didn't ask permission. I just brought my tools and made it solid, and Lily sat on the rail and handed me screws she'd sorted by size, and she asked me, in that careful voice of hers, whether I was going to be around more now. I didn't promise. Promises were the thing I'd watched break this house once already, and I wasn't going to add another careless one to the pile. I told her I was here today. I said I liked being here, and I told her I'd see her tomorrow too, and that was the most I'd ever let myself say to another person, let alone a 4-year-old who deserved the whole truth and not a piece of it. A week later, on an evening when Lily was already asleep upstairs, Charlotte and I sat out on the porch where the step was finally solid. The light above the door was on, and the yard was quiet, and the air smelled like the last of her flowers and the first cool edge of fall. She'd made tea, and she held the cup with both hands the way people do when they're about to say something that costs them. She told me she was terrified. Not of me, she said, but of letting Lily hope again and then watching it break. She said she'd rather have one quiet, fake evening than one more real one that ended, because she could survive another disappointment, but she didn't think she could watch her daughter survive one. She said it plainly, without tears, and that was what made it land so hard, the way the truest things always come out flat and steady, because the person saying them has used up all their drama already. I sat with that for a while, because she deserved more than a quick answer. Then I told her the thing I'd never said out loud to anyone, not to my friends, not to myself in all the years since my father died. I told her I'd spent my whole life fixing things and walking away, because staying was the one job I didn't know how to do. I admitted I'd learned to leave before I could be left, and that being good at it had slowly turned me into a man with a house full of tools and no one to come home to. I told her I was scared. Scared I'd get it wrong with her. Scared I'd get it wrong with Lily. Scared that one day I'd feel the old pull to fix something and vanish, and I wouldn't be strong enough to stay instead. I didn't dress it up. I let it sit there between us, ugly and honest, because she'd been honest with me, and I owed her the same. She didn't fill the quiet. She let it sit too, and I loved her for that, for knowing that some things get cheaper if you talk over them. The porch light buzzed above us, and somewhere down the road a dog barked once and stopped, and the world got very small and very still around the two of us. Then I gave her the rest of it. I said I wasn't going to promise to be perfect, because perfect was a lie, and we'd agreed to stop telling those. What I could promise was to be here, and to learn how to stay, and to be the kind of man who fixes the broken step and then sits on it in the evening instead of driving away. I told her I wanted to be the tall person in Lily's drawing, and that I knew wanting it wasn't the same as deserving it, but I was willing to do the work of becoming the kind of man who did. She set the tea down and looked at me for a long time, and I watched the fear in her face do battle with something brighter and braver underneath it. Then she reached over and took my hand, the way she'd done it at her mother's door, and this time there was no act around it, no family watching, no story to hold up. There was just her hand in mine on a solid step that I'd fixed and was now, for the first time in my life, planning to sit on again tomorrow. She kissed me then, under the porch light, and it wasn't the kind of kiss that happens in movies. It was slow and uncertain and a little afraid, the kind of kiss that happens when two careful people finally stop being careful, and it felt less like a beginning and more like arriving somewhere I'd been walking toward for a very long time. I didn't become her daughter's father that night. You don't earn a name like that in an evening, and I wouldn't have wanted to, because a name a child gives you is the one thing you can't take a shortcut to. What I became was the man who came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the slow work of that was the only way a thing like that ever turns true. Weeks turned into months the way they do when you stop counting them. One morning I walked up the porch step I'd fixed, and Lily ran to the door ahead of me and called out to her mother that I was here. She used the name she'd finally settled on, the one she'd earned the right to give in her own time. Charlotte was in the kitchen with the light on, and she looked up when I came in, and the house that used to be quiet had a porch light on for someone now, and that someone was me. The family is still being built, day by day, the way anything worth keeping always is. The bravest thing a man like me can do isn't to fix what's broken, but to stay and live inside what he repaired. If my story warmed your heart, leave a comment below and tell me which moment got you the most.